Hi, I'm Dr. Kasia Lech. I'm an actor, dramaturg, multilingual storyteller, and also a scholar. I'm speaking today at the Academic Writing and Publishing workshop about how you can get the best out of the peer review process as part of the publishing or grant searching or wherever you're getting that peer review. I'll be mainly focusing on publishing, and that's because as well as doing all that other stuff, I'm one of the editors of the theatretimes.com, which is the largest global theater portal that seeks to decolonize, the westernize discourse on theater and broadly understood performance practice in the world. But when I started my PhD many years ago, I had no theoretical background. I had no academic background. I came from the Conservatoire, which had some what we understood theory subjects, so history of theater, etc. But these were not subjects we cared much about. These were not subjects we could get thrown out of the school for. Our efforts went into the practice. When I came and I started my PhD, I have not written a long piece of academic work for a very long time. To make it even more difficult, I moved from the Polish context where I grew up, where I trained, into Ireland in English-speaking context that had very different rules, not only of language, syntax, essay writing, but also academia. So this is the experience that I be building on today. And after that, we'll talk. Any questions will be very welcome. I'm going to share my screen. Getting the best of your peer review feedback. So I think what's really helpful in starting that discussion is that we first of all look at that peer review process, because feedback comes at some stage of that process, but understanding feedback, understanding where it's coming from, and therefore understanding what it is that you can get out of it requires understanding the entire process as in theater, right? Submission of the paper. So you're submitting a paper and different publishers, different journals, different portals will have a different guidance, and that guidance will be very clearly or should be very clearly explained on their website. After you submit a paper, editor, usually editor-in-chief would look at it and think, okay, does this fit? So each journal, each publisher, each series within publisher, each portal will usually have a mission statement somewhere, either if it's only printed somewhere in the printed collection, but there would normally these days be an online version. So somewhere on that online version, there would be information for authors, and they would explain the scope of the journal. So what is the journal interested in? It might be interested in media, interdisciplinary work, contemporary theater, classical theater, design, particular aspects about design. It might be interested in a particular art in very specific cultural context or national context, or quite the opposite, international context. So these guidance are really important to read before submitting it, because these are the guidance, these are the parameters against which the editor will be assessing it. Does this fit? And that's only one of the things. Another issue would be, have we published much about it? Is it a topic that we have discussed relentlessly for the last few numbers, or is it something we haven't heard much about? And it doesn't mean one or another. So if we haven't published it, it doesn't mean automatically you will get it published. If we have published 100 articles, it doesn't necessarily you will not publish it, but it will be, of course, part of that conversation. After that, the review process will start, and editor will usually reach out to 2 reviewers, sometimes 3. Sometimes originally they will reach out to 2 reviewers, but then in the process, one of the reviewer can't respond within the time, and they will have to seek a 3rd reviewer. Then suddenly 3 reviews come back, and you will get 3 reviews, 3 different opinions. And they will reach for scholars who have expertise that broadly fits the essay, not necessarily the way you understand it, but the way the editor read it in the context of their specific journal. And that is really important to remember. And I will say it again, it will be broadly understood expertise, because not always, and sometimes, of course, sometimes you will get that one expert who is very deeply in exactly field you are in. But more often, you will get someone who is broadly within the field you are in. So for example, if you're writing about film in Nigeria between 1990s and 2000s, you might get a film scholar who has a perspective on Nigeria, but not necessarily on that 10 years, or somebody that is a film scholar, simply interested in one of the themes rather than cultural, but actually one of the themes you are speaking about, let's say, political protest. And then the review assessments will start. A majority of journals, majority of publishers, majority of editors have a very specific structure that they request and questions that they ask the reviewers to answer. Not all of them, but majority will have those questions. They will be asking about, does this fit the scope of the journal, the quality of the scholarship, the quality of the argument, originality of the argument, the contribution to the field. So these are some of the questions they may ask. After the reviewers respond to that, they send it to the editor, and the editor reads the responses. And here what happens may vary. So some editors choose to put the responses together from all the reviewers and digest it and mediate to you the answers they want you to hear. Some of the editors choose to send you each reviewer, and these are blind reviews, so you'll never know who it is that review your work. They more often than not do not know who wrote the work. Well, theoretically, because sometimes you can know if there's one specialist of a particular discipline, but this is a blind review, so they will not know your name and you will not know their name. And the editors will send you, calling the reviewers as reviewer 1, reviewer 2, reviewer 3, depending on how many reviewer is, and will ask you to address the review, or they will simply reject without any review. But that hardly ever happens at the last one. So after the editor addresses the review, they will send you the responses. And first of all, they reject the paper, which happens, but usually you will get the reviews with it and the reasoning why. Another response you may get is accept the paper with major revision, which is very often and probably one of the most often, especially for early career scholars, which means that the publisher is interested with in a paper, in a book, in an article, in an essay, but need you to change something like a case study, or adjust the argument, or develop certain aspects of an argument, add some more readings, critical review, clarify conclusion, depending on what it is. An answer might be accept with minor revisions. So that could be correction of a name, simple clarification of 1 2 sentences, or accept with no revisions. The accept with no revision answer is a bit like Santa Claus. So everyone heard, but nobody actually has ever witnessed it happening. So I don't think that ever happens. I think accept with minor revisions is basically accept with no revisions. It's the highest, the best acceptance that normally happens, at least within the field of the arts. So you got those responses, right? Accept with major revisions, accept with minor revisions. What do you do? And for the remaining of this presentation, I will particularly focus on that accept with major revisions or reject the paper, but with feedback provided. What do you do with this feedback? Do not make any changes until you read, process, and reflect on the reviews. I cannot stress how important it is. I'm going to unpack it in a second, but that do not change anything. Do not delete, do not burn your manuscript, do not do anything until you process. How do you process? This is, one of the memes I found on the internet, and I thought it is really appropriate. If reviewers were dinosaurs, searching through the internet, you will find so many stories of the infamous reviewer tool, which is not always reviewer tool, but it's that infamous reviewer tool who rips your hope, puts your research down, talks about your naivety, because that seems to be very often repeated. It's an easy claim to make. This is very naive to put something down. And yes, that happens. That happens because reviews can be painful. They are very often. Reading the reviews can be painful. Reading the reviews can be frustrated. You will feel that the reviewer hasn't read your work properly. They don't know, they don't have the expertise that you may need, that they have not understood what you are trying to say, that they have read it too quickly, that they have not engaged with it properly, that they are not being fair. You will feel that at some stage in your career when you will get that review. Reviewer will have limited time reviewing your work. So very often, and I think it's really important to remember, reviewing in academia happens on a voluntary basis. So it is someone giving their time to develop another researcher's work. And it might be a researcher that operates within the same field, that they might completely disagree with, have a very different perspective. They be doing it at different time of the academic year, when the pressure is mounting, when they have their own deadlines, when they're negotiating their own life. So it's not that they can sit and spend hours reviewing your work. Yes, it would be in the ideal work, but this is not the reality of the work. There will be very limited work, very often just before the deadline to submit the review, or upon the editor emailing the reviewer, did you have a chance? Did you have a chance to look at that work I have sent you? Can you please send it to me by the end of the week? So that limited time is really important. But then when you think about how you're researching, how you're engaging with others' research, that is also the case for many of us, that yes, sometimes we have that luxury to sit and, dive deep into a research and read the article. But very often we have a limited amount of time for research, 2 hours in the morning, for example, before bringing children to crash, or before looking after someone we care for, or going to work. And we read quite quickly. So there is that position. So that reviewer position is not different to majority of your readers or your potential readers. Reviewers will not always have the expertise you would like them to have, but neither will many readers. Because if your work was only read by people that have exactly the expertise you want to have, think about how many people in the world would read your work. In a sense, that's the more your work is read by people who have no expertise in the field you are expert in, the better it is for your work, because it means it speaks to interdisciplinary fields. Some reviewers are bad, and some reviews are bad. They're unhelpful, they're personal, they're culturally biased. This is true. Accented writing, this is not my term. It's a term I'm borrowing from Professor Jana Merzon, who talks about accented writing. So that writing where not even non-native English speaker, but someone coming from non-English or non-American background writes in English, and there is always one of the reviewers that will say, the sentences are grammatically correct, but smack of the second language speaker, or sound strange, perhaps the writer is the second language speaker, or there are some grammar mistakes, it must be a second language speaker. And it is hurtful sometimes, because on the one hand, academia keeps talking about its wish to bring cultural insiders from different cultural contexts. On the other hand, it forgets that not all cultural contexts are Anglo-English or Anglo-American. So there is that there is no answer to it. There is no, I don't have a magic wand to wave and make it away. But I think it's that awareness that you're not the only one if you get that review. It's one of the most common points for that for anyone, for any scholar, any practitioner coming from non-Anglo-American or not Anglo-English background, or perhaps Irish is also within that Anglo-American, so Western English speaking world. That is very often happening, and that will usually be accompanied by a recommendation. Please find a friend who is a fluent native English speaker so they can help you the review. And some of us will have those friends that are happy to, some of us won't. And I encourage you that if you don't, or if it's not possible for you, or you don't feel like you can ask someone for it, it is okay to write to the reviewer, to the editor in your response, and I come back to it, asking, I actually don't know anyone that could do it. Can you recommend someone? Would you be able to provide? Because in a sense, that responsibility for language support, for editing, should be also on the publishers and journals. And in the theatretimes.com, which operates purely on voluntary basis from everyone, one of the very, very, very few, and actually the only ones for most of the time, people that are getting paid are our editors, language editors, who support non-native English speakers or people coming from non-Western English language backgrounds in communicating what it is. And then another thing is about that confidence on using when there is no word in English, because sometimes there are no words in English that explain something that you want to say. It's having that confidence to be able to use the word from another language that much better explains what it is that you are trying to say. In a sense, for example, that French scholars have that courage to do it. Mise en scène, term that operates in theater, in film, in particular, is not translated into English. And of course, French language enjoys that global privilege similar to English. But I think it is okay, and it is important for all of us to have that courage. Apart from that digression on the accented writing that I wanted to address, I think what I'm trying to say by reviews can be painful, reviews can be frustrating, reviewers are people like your readers, is that as a practitioner who can be very sensitive about her work, I find it helpful to look at the peer review process as a focus group or a work in progress audience that are providing me feedback before it actually gets to the real audience, if you know what I mean. So in a sense, it's that perfect critic that you're inviting to your performance, to your exhibition, to see a film before everyone else see it. So you have that opportunity to fix it before the wider readership can engage with it, to make it more accessible, easier for that readership to get from your work what it is that you want them to get. And this sort of frees you from that thinking, what the reviewer, are they trying to hurt me? Why they're being so horrible? Do they have bad intentions? Do they have good intentions? In a sense, it makes that person of a reviewer irrelevant. It makes their feedback relevant as a piece of response that you are getting before the opening day night of your work. And there is a story to illustrate that. My first book, The Story of Pain. It was 2014 or 2015 that I have submitted my book proposal to Routledge. It was book on verse in theater across several languages and countries. And I got quite quickly 2 reviews. I opened the first one and I felt so happy. It is on the leading edge of its field in the use of timely and relevant examples. The scholarship is adequate. In fact, it is very good. I recommend this book for publication. I was thrilled. And then I opened the second review that explained to me why the editor in her email was saying How do I respond to it? Considerations on the interaction between form and content are often naive. The argument does not follow logical steps, and the discussion of the performative import of verse in the selected drama is poor and often flawed. The author seems to ignore the basics of drama studies. As a mere sample of the overall weakness of the book, here's a very concise list of the many shortcomings of one chapter. No relocation of contents would be sufficient to improve it, in a sense, this work. I responded very emotionally and pointing out when the reviewer did not read my work. The book proposal got rejected. I used the book is now published by the same publisher, by Lech. I came back to them about a year and a half later. There was a different editor then in place. I have used that review 2 more than I have used that review 1, not because that review 2, I agree with him. I still disagree with him, but I got out everything I could from that really personal, very hurting, very unhelpful review I could to think about what it was that they did not get from my book proposal and what it is that I could do to change that. And the book is now published. This is the reviews. Work of an outstanding critic, will help spawn global conversation for years to come, will help a young multimedia savvy generation to unlock anew this radical force of the verse. And I'm quoting that not to praise myself. I'm quoting that to tell you that on that journey where you will get, because all of us will, I don't think there's any scholar that has never gotten that awful, unhelpful, personal, heart-ripping review, that there is a light at the end of that tunnel, that there is a way to turn it around, and there is a way of using that review to improve your work. And even from the worst review in the world, the most unhelpful review of the world, you can find something there. Even if the reviewer had the worst intentions in the world, you can find something there to make your work better, to make your work clearer, to make your argument clear for the broader readership. And this is what I want to show you, how I do it, how I did it, and how you can do it, or you can use it to find your own way through it. Action plan, part 1, reflection. Before you do anything, reflect. What do I mean? Read the reviews so many times until it stops being painful. In a sense, when you get a really good review, it also read it so many times until it stops being excited, until it stops make you feel either super happy or super sad or super angry. Anything that emotions are great. As an artist, we know it, but in that moment of reviewing your work and getting the best of the peer review, those emotions are not your friend. So read it so many times until you stop feel what you're feeling. And once you stop feeling what you're feeling, turn those comments into objectives, and regardless whether you agree with them or not, for now. So what do I mean? Those of you that come from theater or especially acting backgrounds will think immediately Konstantin Stanisławski and the objectives. And yes, that's what I mean. I mean, for you to look at the comments provided by the reviewer, each reviewer separately, break them into lines. So reviewer says something like, Homi Bhabha's perspective on culture would greatly contribute to this argument and improve its engagement with a given case study, let's say, right? So that's the comment. And under that, I can write, I will break it into one line, so just one line, and it's separate from the rest of the text. And in a different color, or if you want to do it in your notebook, on your computer, whatever works for you, I would put an objective to include Homi Bhabha's perspective on culture, right? If another comment is about how the introduction is confusing and doesn't provide a clear scope for what it is that this essay is about, action point, to rewrite introduction, to limit my argument to one case study, to spell check, to ask colleague for proofreading. and so on. So as an example, I will give you from that of those shortcomings that my chapter had according to the reviewer that originally rejected my book for publishing. Jebb's edition, it was an edition, is a translation of Antigone I was using in my book, has long been discarded. The author might have consulted Mark Griffin's recent Cambridge UP edition to get some basic information regarding the value of meter in performance. Now, I was using Jebb's edition because Seamus Heaney, about whom I was writing, was using that edition, which I made it clear. And I remember when I got that review originally, in my response to the editor, I pointed out that that's the Heaney, and it says on page 50, line 3, it says that sentence, and reviewer didn't say that sentence, therefore let's disregard the review. But the editor did not accept that, simply because I can see that from this perspective, another reader might have also missed that one sentence. So when I was then writing my book proposal, writing my book, I just put an action point. I didn't have all those comments because those comments were evoking something. I just took the action points to consult Mark Griffith's recent Cambridge UP edition of Antigone. And has it changed the direction of my argument? No, it hasn't. It just added that extra cherry on the top that I was showing. I'm consulting several editions of Antigone. And therefore, if somebody missed the Jebb comment on page 50, they also knew that I was consulting several editions rather than just one. Reflection and mediation, and it might require research. So after you have changed all those comments into action points, whether you agree with them or not, this is what I suggest you do. Mark, what do you agree with? What is helpful? What is essential? So sometimes editors in particular, in sending you the reviewer's response, will also say what are the essential changes they recommend you do. Sometimes it is the reviewers that will make very clearly what it is, what do they mean by essential changes, what has to change for them to accept the work to be published. What can you live with? The way I could live with the Mark Griffin. I didn't think it was necessary to include it, but I could live with it. What can you live with it? What is possible? Because, if the reviewer says something like, oh, it's such a pity that this research does not have a 10-year observation process included, that would give that and that and that perspective. Yes, of course it would, but is that possible? Do reviews give conflicting advice? And this will happen more often than you think. You may read, for example, the third paragraph of the introduction should be cut as it not contributes anything to the discussion. Reviewer 1. Reviewer 2 will say, the paragraph 3 in the introduction is particularly interesting and it should be expanded as it gives the insight. What do? I will speak about it in a second. For now, highlight if there are any conflicted advice. What is not possible? Because, for example, it will damage the core of your argument. Write down and do not send why a specific comment cannot be actioned in your paper. Write it down, just for now, for whatever reason, and it may change. Then think about the conflicted reviews. So sometimes the conflicted review will be about the editor recommendation and one of the reviewers, in which case you always go with the editor. And in responses to how you address that review, you mention that you have followed the editor's recommendation. However, and that happens the most often, it will be the two reviewers that will have the conflicted guidance, in which case you may consult, if you want, the editor, if you feel appropriate. You may ask a colleague who knows your work well for a discussion, a dialogue around it, to have a look and see what they recommend. But what you must do, and that's the most important, is trusting yourself and trusting your instinct, trusting the person that have created that work. If you have a co-author, of course, this is easier because you can have a discussion. But you will have to, you cannot satisfy two conflicted reviews. you will have to choose one, and you have to choose the one that you feel will benefit your work, your argument the most. And then you can address that in the comment again, quoting the other reviewer and explaining why you have chosen to follow this reviewer and not the other. So after you have done all that extensive work, there is a issue of to-do list. So redraft the list. So looking now of what it is that you've agreed with, what it is that you chose you have to do, make that into a to-do list. So write down all the stuff you still have to do and consider how much time you will need, and then add 50% to that. So if you think the revisions will take you 2 months, ask for 3 months. If you think the revisions will take you 4 months, ask for 6 months, and so on. Of course, you should have replied to the editor immediately after receiving the responses with simple, thank you, I will be in touch with you as soon as I have read and processed the reviews. This is now the moment when you can respond to the editor and ask for the specific time for the revisions. And again, say thank you for the suggestions that will undoubtedly develop your research, because they will undoubtedly develop your work. And the editing. Action plan part 3, editing. First of all, track change. So everything you do in that first essay, work, book you have submitted, track change. So the reviewers, in particular when it's a journal article, so the reviewers can see the changes you have made to the work. And second of all, keep the track of how the changes relate to the comments. So later on, when you are responding to the reviewers and you are explaining how you have addressed each of the comments, you can put the page number that these comments and the changes that address these comments are on. So the reviewers can find them really easily. And you save their time, therefore, you are allowing them to engage with your work in more depth, which is what we want. Action plan part 4, responding to the reviewers. Use the first one, comment one action list. So that first list that you have created when you broke each reviewer comments into 1 lines, right? Take the action out, but leave that comments broken into lines. Respond to every comment, indicating how you addressed it or not in the manuscript with the page number details. Make it clear and easily readable. Save the reviewer time. The more time you save them from following your responses, the more time they will have to go in depth into your work, and the less frustrated they will be, therefore in better mood they will be to receive your arguments. Leave it for a day before sending. So once you have responded to every single reviewer separately, leave it for a day before sending, read it again, and only send it then. So how can that response may look like? For example, you can put an actual comment in a bold or in italics. So for example, too many case studies confuses the reader. Response. I have made the piece by Jota Noob, it's a made-up name, my main case study, and I have limited others to a brief mention on page 23. So you are responding specifically how you have addressed that comment. Sending the response. Attach a response to each reviewer as a separate document, and then have a brief cover letter in the email in which you say thank you for all the suggestions, all the work the reviewers and the editors have put into it. Remember that the editor, very likely, and the reviewers, most likely, are doing it for free in their own time to develop your work. This is something really important to remember. And there may be a second round of reviews. And that happens very often, that one of the reviewers or both of the reviewers will still have additional suggestions, additional questions that they will come back to you, and they will ask you to do some further changes or not. That depends. This is not uncommon, and this is a positive one, This is you being in a conversation about your work, which is great because we all love our work and we love talking about it. So treat that process of peer review as a conversation, asynchronous one, but one aimed, no matter what the reviewer's intentions are, at making your work more readable and more engaging for broader group of readership. Thank you. I now welcome questions from you.